Welcome to our webinar, Vicarious Trauma and Responders to Mass Violence. My name is Karen Kalurgis, and I first got involved in working with victim services in mass violence in 1991. I had just been struggling with how do people do the work of victim services on the day-to-day when I was called to respond to the mass shooting at the Luby's cafeteria. And then the question became not only how do we handle the day-to-day, but how do we handle the additional stresses that come from a mass violence incident? And since that time, I've been involved in a number of opportunities to develop training and technical assistance materials on addressing vicarious trauma. And that's what part of what I'll share with you today. Dave?
Hello, my name is Dave Thomas, and I am a retired police officer from Montgomery County, Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. I've been doing work addressing vicarious trauma in earnest really over the last 3 years, but I've been doing a lot of training on trauma and the neurobiology of trauma for responders, law enforcement in particular, since about 2010. And I do training all over the U.S. and very happy to be with you here today. Mitch.
Hi, my name is Mitch Cunningham. I've been in law enforcement for 37 years. I'm currently the Chief Law Enforcement Advisor for the National Sheriff's Association. But prior to that, I was Deputy Chief for the Wilmington, North Carolina Police Department. And prior to that, I was with a police department in the DC area as a member of the command staff during the DC sniper case. I've worked a lot over the years with regards to peer support, concerned with officer mental health, and teach around the country training on police suicide, officer mental health wellness. So this is a topic that is near and dear and very close to my heart.
Hi, my name is Tara Hughes. I am the director of the ICP TTA program. That program is the Improving Community Preparedness to assist victims of mass violence and domestic terrorism training and technical assistance program. That is how we're bringing you this webinar today. My experience is as a mental health clinician, a trauma therapist for 35 years, and a responder to mass violence and domestic terrorism in the short term, the intermediate term, and the long term for the last 17 years, and have responded to some of the bigger events that have happened in the United States, the Boston Marathon, Sandy Hook Elementary School, Las Vegas, Pulse nightclub, Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, and as we are recording this, the Buffalo Tops grocery store shooting. So coming to you as a subject matter expert in mass violence and domestic terrorism. And as Mitch and Dave have both talked from their experience, and Karen from her experience and her education, vicarious trauma is hugely important when we talk about anything that has to do with mass violence and domestic terrorism. So we are very happy that you're here today. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Karen, and she's going to get started.
Thank you, Tara. So our learning objectives for today is that we hope that you will be able to build on your understanding of vicarious trauma. You'll be able to understand how mass violence and domestic terrorism incidents pose unique challenges to those of us who are doing this work. We're going to give you some organizational strategies that will help you prepare for and provide support to responders before, during, and after the mass violence incident. And we also hope to be able to give you some strategies to enhance your own personal preparedness. So let's take a closer look at two terms we'll use a lot today: trauma and vicarious trauma. If you are new to vicarious trauma or find yourself with some unknown terms or questions in this first section, we highly encourage you to pause this training and watch OVC TTAC's introduction to the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. The training is entitled Creating Vicarious Trauma-Informed Organizations, Strategies for Success. A link can be found in the description for this vicarious trauma training and can also be found on OVC's YouTube page. Once you finish that training, then come back here to learn about vicarious trauma specifically related to mass violence incidents. How do we define trauma? The American Psychiatric Association defines trauma as an emotional response to a terrible event. The word response is important because you'll see how as we talk about each one of these things, you hear about them in terms of feelings. Trauma includes the exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury or sexual violence. It could be a car accident, a crime, or a natural disaster such as a flood, a tornado, or a hurricane. It involves a threat to one's physical and emotional well-being. It doesn't matter that that gun was not loaded. The person didn't know that at the time. Thus, their response was to what they believed was real. The individual is physically, psychologically, and or cognitively overwhelmed and has intense feelings of fear and lack of control. It just leaves one feeling helpless. This exposure to trauma can create a response that changes the way a person understands the world and themselves. What about vicarious trauma or indirect trauma? That's the response to experiencing firsthand repeated or extreme exposure to the trauma experiences of others. Or put simply, it's taking someone else's trauma and internalizing it as your own. It's not surprising to see how this work can be a potential occupational challenge for people. Victim services is sometimes described as listening a soul back to existence. First responders rush into the danger, not away from it. This work is a continuous exposure to the trauma of others. Dr. Rachel Remen, who did significant work in the medical field, put it this way: the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet. Our responses can range from negative to neutral to positive, suggesting that there is not one response to trauma and vicarious trauma. So we're going to offer you some suggestions on how we can affect what that response is. But first, let's talk more about how our brain reacts to trauma and vicarious trauma with Tara Hughes.
Thank you, Karen. So I'm just going to do a very brief 101 on neurobiology of trauma. And the first thing to know is that when something happens in your environment, as Karen said, that is not the trauma. The event is not the trauma. Our reaction is the trauma. So when we look at what's happening in our brains, what we're looking at is what our brains are able to accomplish during those times. And one of the things we know is that trauma happens when our brains get overwhelmed. And when they get overwhelmed, and this is very basic, they basically divide into two components. You have the survival part of your brain, and you have everything else, everything, higher level thinking, all of that kind of stuff. When we feel overwhelmed at that extreme high level of stress, that is trauma, we have a reaction where our brain shuts down everything else and just goes into survival mode. And when that happens, what we do is we tend to pick one coping skill that works for us in that moment to reduce our anxiety, because our survival is about reducing anxiety and being able to get away from the threat. So when we have a trauma, something happens, it's a car accident or you're caught in a fire or something like that. We have that reaction where when we get activated, when something reminds us of that trauma, we go back to that one coping skill. When there is multiple instances of trauma, repeated sexual assault, repeated sexual abuse of a child, severe neglect of a child, there's a component that gets added in there of avoidance of things that will activate that part of our brain. So we see a little bit of that when it's one incident, but we see a lot of that when it is multiple repeated incidents. So you have someone who has a long history of sexual assault, and they avoid relationships, they may avoid places where the assaults have happened or that they associate with the assaults. And they still go back to that one coping mechanism. So it may be that they dissociate and they just don't connect anymore to what's happening in front of them. It may be that they reach out to people and become what some people might refer to as needy. And they need other people around them because that reduces their anxiety and feeds that survival component of their brain. When you look at mass violence, what you are looking at is a situation where multiple things may cause trauma in someone's brain or a trauma reaction in someone's brain. So it may be multiple people being shot. It may be having to run for your life. It may be having to hide. It may be having to come face to face with the shooter and surviving. What we know about someone who lives through a mass violence response is that they do a lot of avoidance. They generally, again, find that one coping mechanism that works for them, and they go back and use that. And that, by the way, can look pretty dysfunctional if you keep going back to the same thing over and over again. And there's a set of almost mental gymnastics people have to go through to be able to do things like go to the grocery store after there's been a shooting at the grocery store, or drop your kids at school or at the movies or any of those things. What we see with vicarious trauma is that we have helpers who are interacting with individuals who have had these multiple exposures to activating things happening for them, and they have experienced trauma. Vicarious trauma is the helpers working with those people and being repeatedly exposed, as Karen said, to that trauma of somebody else. What happens with vicarious trauma in terms of neurobiology is there is a tremendous amount of exposure. But that exposure is not your exposure, it's somebody else's exposure. That does not change necessarily how your brain interprets it on a whole. So you may start to internalize that trauma in your own brain and start to have that survival versus everything else reaction in your own brain. There may be a lot of avoidance for you. The one thing that we see a lot is the need for those mental gymnastics I was talking about before. This trauma is not yours. You did not live it, but you have now incorporated it into your brain, and your brain on one level is dealing with it as if it is happening to your brain. On the other level, there is a lot of, there's an understanding that it's not yours, that it's somebody else's. And there's a lot of personal judgment that goes into how you're managing that. So now you have a lot of exposure to trauma. You have a lot of exposure to other people's trauma. You are trying to cope yourself, and you're also feeling this sense of judgment. This isn't mine. I shouldn't be, quote unquote, I shouldn't be reacting this way because it's not my trauma. But your brain thinks it's your trauma. And there is an exhaustion that goes with that hits responders in the short term, but also lingers for quite a lengthy period of time. With that description as a foundation, I'm going to hand it off to Dave Thomas, and he is going to help with some definitions about mass violence and domestic terrorism.
Thank you, Tara. You know, it's really vitally important that we define mass violence, criminal mass violence, and domestic terrorism so that we're all on the same page. Mass violence or criminal mass violence refers to any intentional violent criminal act causing physical, emotional, or psychological harm to a great number of people. Domestic terrorism includes events that involve criminal activities dangerous to human life by intending to intimidate or coerce or influence the policy of government, and finally affect the conduct of government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping. Note, over the last years, we've seen a steady increase in criminal mass violence incident. And this is just looking at the last 5 years. As a result, it is increasingly important that you are aware of the impacts of these incidents and the impact that they can have on first responders. Mass violence is not determined by the number of dead or injured, but it does have a criminal justice system component, and the emergency management system is activated as part of that response. This includes high-profile incidents like the Las Vegas Heritage Music Festival shooting, the worst mass shooting in modern American history, in which at least 58 people were killed and hundreds more were injured. The anti-Semitic Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, in which a lone gunman killed 11 people and wounded 6, several of which were Holocaust survivors, or the Buffalo grocery shooting. There's also Stoneman Douglas High School shooting, in which a teen gunman killed 17 and injured 17 at this Parkland, Florida high school. Incidents of mass violence not only have an impact on the community where they occur, but a wider impact as well. The grief associated with these incidents is personal and public, and people develop expectations surrounding this grief. Fear is also widespread. This wasn't a dispute between individuals who know each other personally. It was random. If these incidents can happen to these people in this place, they can happen to anyone, anywhere. Blame is used as a mechanism to gain control, but this becomes harder when the incident seems random. If the perpetrator or perpetrators are killed or are juveniles, criminal mass violence, domestic terrorism incidents are even harder to process. Why would they do this? How are they created? People typically turn to dissociation as a means of coping, but this becomes harder and harder to maintain with repeated incidents. They begin asking questions like, what kind of world do we live in? Who can I consider to be safe? And developing the mindset that systems can't be trusted to keep me safe anymore. For individuals involved in the incident or response, triggers are seemingly endless, and coping mechanisms are needed for people to function across many aspects of daily life. Going to the grocery store, grabbing lunch with a friend, or even hearing sirens while walking down the street can create heightened levels of stress. With every report of a new attack, even a distant one, individuals revisit the impact of their own traumatic event. Additional complicating factors include gun control debates and views on vulnerability. Now, Tara is going to take us through about a little bit more of how these events pan out.
Thanks, Dave. So we're looking at a graph that actually shows you the trajectory of many events. Actually, all of the events that I've ever been involved in have followed this trajectory. It is my favorite graph. Because it is so descriptive, and who knew as an adult I could have a favorite graph, but I do. And the reason is that it really talks about both the individual and the community and what happens during these incidences. So what we're looking at when we talk about mass violence and domestic terrorism, if you look at the left-hand side of the chart, you have a pre-disaster component that we don't get with mass violence or domestic terrorism. So what you get is an impact, and you get something that is very sudden and unexpected and seemingly out of the blue. Even though we're seeing more of them, they're still out of the blue. Everyone thinks these won't happen in our world. This won't happen in my community. what we see initially is a huge rise, a coalescing of the community. The community comes together and pulls services together, takes care of their own. And there really is a honeymoon phase that happens initially. Pretty quickly after that, what you see is what is known as the disillusionment phase. A couple things happen here that people need to be aware of. The first one is that all of the people who have rushed in to help start to leave. They go back to their normal jobs, or the crisis point is over, and so people are leaving. So that's one thing. The other thing that happens is that there is a sense that even with this community cohesion and people coming together, life has changed and you are not going back. And that realization becomes very quickly a component of what people are trying to manage as they go through this. And what happens is that they start to realize that the system isn't going to save them, that donated funds aren't going to save them, that they have still either lost a loved one has been injured, or they have been injured, their community has changed forever. And that disillusionment phase lasts for quite a while. And there's really no sense of it's gonna last for a year or a couple of months. It really depends on both the individual and the community. What we know is that individuals do this on their own. They go through this very trajectory, but the community does as a whole as well. So you will see people, if there were fractures between agencies or between governments and nonprofits that pre-existed this event, you are going to see those become heightened and maybe expand and become worse. This is not the time to necessarily repair relationships. That can happen, but most of the time, those fractures are going to get bigger in this disillusionment phase. When you look at the graph, what you see is the disillusionment phase lasts for a while, and then there starts to be some up and downs. And I think what we know is that people as individuals and communities go through tons of ups and downs in terms of recovery, feeling like something really great has happened and I feel good today, and then maybe something drops off and I don't feel good tomorrow. Included in that, and Dave talked about this a while ago, is things happen outside of your community. So Buffalo happened a week ago Saturday at this taping, and then on Sunday there was actually a shooting at a church in California. So we're not getting a rest from this, and each one of those instances will activate people who have been exposed to a mass violence event themselves. That includes responders. So part of what we want you to be looking at is the idea that this honeymoon and then disillusionment phase will impact all of the responders. There's a lot of energy that goes into the first couple of weeks after this. There's a lot of exhaustion that comes from that. There's a lot of having to go back to your normal quote unquote job. All of that feeds into the disillusionment phase. All of that feeds into hearing what people really thought about the incident or the response. You may hear that people were unhappy with the response time of the police, or there were dispatch issues, or that it seemed like different, the state maybe and the county and the city weren't working together in terms of responders. So there's a lot of that kind of information that comes out. The other thing that will start to happen very quickly in this disillusionment time period is lawsuits. There are a lot of lawsuits that happen, and they generally are aimed at whoever has money. So if you are a police department, a fire department, dispatch, a county, a city, the FBI, frankly, you are likely to get sued after these events because people want to feel better and they think suing people is going to make that happen. So anyways, lots of ups and downs. The trial, by the way, will be one of those huge downs. It is very challenging for not just individuals who were victims, but also responders to go through trials. and to hear the way things are presented and to then have verdicts that they may or may not agree with. The one thing I want to end on is looking at the fact that the red line is the trajectory that everyone is on. If you drew a straight line from the left side of the graph where you started with the pre-disaster or the impact, and you draw it straight across the graph, what you see on the right-hand side is that the line is higher. And what we know is that something called post-traumatic growth happens. Even if it's incredibly challenging, a lot of people and a lot of communities end up learning about themselves, learning about their ability to function in a crisis, learning about what they can bring to the table that they didn't maybe even know they had. So that line at the end of this graph is higher than it was at the beginning because learning has happened. And that is often referred to as post-traumatic growth. So again, I never knew that I would have a favorite graph, but I do. Because it's so descriptive. I'm now going to hand it back to Karen and let her start to talk about the exposure of responders to the trauma of others.
Thanks, Tara and Dave, for really setting up what we're looking at in this mass violence experience. So the question we have before us is to answer Dr. Remen's question about what can we do if we're saying that our exposure to all of these things, we can't expect to be exposed to all this suffering of other people. It's kind of like walking through water and not getting wet. The question before us is, what can we do so that we may get wet, but we do not drown? And part of the really good thing that's happened over the recent years, research is putting a new focus on the idea of resiliency and the recognition that while survivors and responders may experience some terrible things, the response is not always a negative one. There is actually a spectrum of responses that range from negative to neutral to positive. What we hear about most often is the negative responses to doing this work, such as vicarious traumatization or secondary traumatic response, or a term from the medical field, compassion fatigue, one we hear a lot about now as healthcare workers deal with the COVID pandemic. But we know there can be a neutral response where the impact of this exposure is managed effectively, or even a positive response like Tara just talked about, where just as we talk about how we might suffer from our work, we talk about what we gain. We talk about vicarious resilience, vicarious transformation. And what is it that moves us from compassion fatigue to compassion satisfaction? The organization has a big role in helping responders move to whether or not their response to this work-related trauma exposure is going to be negative, neutral, or positive. And the stakes are really high. If the organization is not doing something to help address the impact of our exposure to what we see and do at work, it will affect us as individuals and it will affect us as organizations. The impact of vicarious traumatizations on organizations has been seen in three main areas: lost productivity, staff turnover, and poor organizational health. If the organization has not addressed the impact of the work in the day-to-day way and have policies in place, then the workers are going to take those negative reactions into the mass violence incident. Mitch and Dave are now going to give us a few examples that as you start to go through the different steps that Tara laid out about what happens during a mass violence incident, if the organization has not addressed vicarious trauma, how is the performance of the people at that mass violence incident going to be affected? So we'll turn it over to you, Mitch, to start us off.
Okay, thank you, Karen. So as you're looking at the slide, you see basically two columns: incident response and compounding factors. And as Karen was saying, when an agency has not adopted policies or really generated a vicarious trauma-informed culture, we're going to see these compounding factors. So here we are, excuse me, in the incident, we got tactile response, something that we're very good at. Some of the other things below where it says tactical response are sometimes things we're not all that familiar with. We're not used to considering the impact. So very quickly, and we're talking about day 1 to 2, now we've got the Family and Friends Reception Center. And that's basically a gathering place. Victims' families are going to be receiving information, basic support services, things that they're going to need in the short term. And it sets up for a longer term response. And we're looking at victim identification, a sensitive and caring place for death notifications. Of course, in these incidents, volunteers, there's a profusion of volunteers coming in, well-meaning, but they require management. They require being identified, categorized, used, and making sure that they're in the right places as the incident unfolds. Donations, right? We see after 9/11, there were so many donations that were flowing into New York City, but they have to be managed, they have to be categorized, they have to be accounted for. And then, of course, the media. It's a major incident. The media will come in mass and they will have to be dealt with. So as we're looking at compounding factors, here's some of the things that your staff and you are dealing with. Just the general physical fatigue, the wear and tear, the emotional draining of being involved in this incident. Tara was explaining the neurobiology to us, and we can see that there's cognitive effects. And again, if this agency hasn't developed this culture, we're going to see things like cynicism and pessimism, maybe some, suppressed anger, hopelessness, etc. We're going to see people being emotionally impacted. And then they're all feeling the pressure to overperform. They don't want to leave their colleagues, the people they're working with, to handle this by themselves. They're pushing themselves, and they're feeling a pressure to really do everything that is needed to address this situation. Part of that results in unwillingness to go home. And now we see that that's going to have an impact in your family life. There's going to be some isolation. There'll be folks at home feeling left out and not understanding this person who is demonstrating physical fatigue and some of these emotions that they're grappling with. If you're not going home and being recharged by the people there starts to be a fracturing that goes on. One of the things that we have learned from these incidents is there becomes some relationship impacts between the people that are providing support and help and the survivors, or there's relationships that develop between coworkers who are bonded together through this shared experience. And of course, again, as I mentioned, people responding, they don't want to leave their colleagues alone. They want to be right in on the field with them, helping out. And so they're feeling this constant tug to return back to the incident. And then ultimately, it results in a problematic work-life balance where negative things can happen, and that can affect them personally, and it can also impact the incident. So now the incident has begun to mature, if you will. It's now into day 3 to 9, and our Family Reception Center has turned into a Family Assistance Center. So they're providing more of a long-term support for the folks that are involved. And they have some very sobering responsibilities, as you can see there. Missing person ID and notification, family members, waiting to find out what happened to their loved one, what an impact that has on the people who are having to handle that. The funerals, preparing for them, making sure people are cared for, are transported from they may be from out of town, there may be specific emotional and physical needs that have to be accounted for. So lots of pressure and responsibility for those who are here working through this incident. Personal effects return. We know in at least one incident, for example, in Las Vegas, that there were hundreds and hundreds of cell phones that had to be returned back to their owners. Some of them were personal property. Some of them had very valuable evidence on them. Of course, the politicians, understandably wanting to be seen as responsive to this incident, now come into into this setting, and they have to be accounted for. There's security concerns, there's informational responsibilities. It adds burden to the folks that are trying to respond to this incident, and it has to be thought through. It has to be addressed. We've got donation stress, and of course, we talked about these volunteers. Well, if they're outside the area, they have to be cared for. They have accommodation needs, they have food needs, and other needs that effectively become our responsibility. It's important to know that there are grants that can help smaller, mid-sized agencies and others to help pay for these incidents. And if you go to our website, you will find more information that can tell you how to apply for those grants. But that's important. There are huge financial impacts to the people associated with this incident response, and happily, there are resources that are available to help them manage through that. Now let's look at the compounding factors. Again, this trauma, right? You're constantly exposed to these families in crisis, and it has an impact on the folks that are responding. Physical and mental exhaustion, the suppressed emotions that you must, as a professional, engage in, has an impact. You'll be struggling off duty as you think back upon your day and what you saw, and this vicarious trauma that Tara was explaining to us, how that affects you personally, emotionally, and physically. And then the frustration with bureaucracy. We want the victims, people affected by this, to get immediate response. We want to see them better. We want to see them, as much as possible, be made whole. And we know we're working in a very bureaucratic system where help may be difficult to obtain because of the documentation, the vetting, the different processes that are in place, and that has impacts on people trying to help victims. And then we're talking about normal agency operations that now are strained. We have people that are working maybe 2 or 3 assignments that they had never worked in before. So their performance may be affecting the incident. So we see this, at this point, a lot of stress on the agency and on the individuals involved.
Now, as the criminal mass violence response moves into days 9 through 30, responders are coordinating a smooth transition from the Family Assistance Center to the Resiliency Center, which focuses on the long-term needs of the victims and the community, and ensuring all avenues of support are maintained and or established. The external support that came in days 3 through 9 often leaves, and the community is left to handle the responsibilities with its own resources while also refocusing on regular responsibilities. Those working the criminal mass violence incident are exhausted. And if the proper vicarious trauma strategies have not been put in place, they are not equipped to deal with the physical and emotional exhaustion and the increased assault on their senses from the criminal mass violence incident. Their exhaustion makes them more rigid in their thinking, with little flexibility in an environment that requires quick thinking as well as teamwork. There is discontent from survivors and responders because the quote unquote special nature of the incident goes away as people return to everyday routines. Motivation and performance are a problem. This shows up with workers being absent or chronically late, with strong feelings of being overworked. They exhibit irresponsibility and poor follow-through. Ultimately, workers will leave the organization, and the staff turnover causes disruption in workloads of others and increased time and resources training people. In the long term, the Resiliency Center remains open. Additionally, there's the added stress of trial processes for living offenders and yearly memorials as well as commemorations. Communities are also grappling with the results of their grant applications. If applications were unsuccessful, responders not only have to figure out alternative means of managing the financial burden of a criminal mass violence response, but also potentially manage anger and frustration of applications being denied. One of the challenges as the criminal mass violence response enters the long-term stage is that if nothing has been done to mitigate the day-to-day impact, workers at the criminal mass violence incident have little or no resources left to draw upon. Their initial coping skills start to fall apart. If initial coping was to be stoic, that starts to crumble. If initial coping was to reach out for help, that stops. These individuals feel that they may be seen as broken if they want to reach out for help. If the initial coping was inappropriate, such as substance abuse, tighter control at home, etc., they get out of control. What shows up as compounding factors is that the responder forms deep connections with victims and survivors and other responders, and they may distance themselves from family, impacting their home lives. So, what do I do now? What's my alternative? You know, if we look at things that we do in our professions to maintain different aspects of our professions, then we start to see where what we can do here. You know, we religiously make certain our fleet of vehicles are routinely taken care of for preventive maintenance. Change the oil, check the tires. Our most valuable commodity, our personnel, need preventive maintenance as well. We need to nurture and take care of our people. The workplace needs to ensure appropriate employee wellness strategies are practiced on an ongoing basis. The same analogy can be provided with respect to physical and psychological injury. When one of our vehicles are involved in a traffic accident, we take it off the road and put it in for repairs only to return when it's like new again. When our personnel are physically injured in the line of duty, we most often do much the same and don't have them return until they are physically fit for duty. This promising practice must also be adopted with respect to psychological injury. We must not only screen for it in the wake of a critical incident, but we must also make certain that our personnel are provided the time for treatment and the support in order that they be able to return for duty after they are psychologically fit for duty as well. Now, Karen is going to provide us with a little bit more insight on this preventive maintenance.
Thanks, Dave. So how do we do that preventative maintenance? We have a model we're going to provide for you that works from the premise that being trauma-informed is being vicarious trauma-informed as well. We are going to offer you a model from the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit that gives you a structured approach with policies, practices, and protocols designed to serve, protect, and sustain your most precious resource, your staff. These are strategies that can be used to handle the day-to-day impact of this work, the so-called preventative maintenance, as well as strategies that can be called on in the mass violence incident. First, let's introduce you to the basic concepts of the toolkit, and then we'll move into some really good examples of how they come into play during a mass violence incident. The Vicarious Trauma Toolkit defines a vicarious trauma-informed organization as one that has strengths in each of these 5 pillars. These pillars are all evidence-informed and are based on what the research says makes an organization healthy. Leadership and mission is the first pillar. It does start at the top. Leadership is aware of and committed to address vicarious trauma as part of the agency's mission and values. That means it's in the strategic plan and budget. Management and supervision. Research shows that this is one of the major influences of maintaining and sustaining staff. All interactions with staff are through a vicarious trauma-informed lens, from hiring to supervising to performance evaluations and support in crisis. Employee empowerment and work environment. Think about Maslow and how the foundation of the hierarchy of needs is that you have your basic needs taken care of: food, shelter, and safety. But vicarious trauma, that means the workplace has to be safe and not cause additional stress. This pillar is dedicated to creating an organizational culture that supports workers. It supports diversity, inclusion, mutual respect, and trust. A vicarious trauma-informed organization provides ways for staff input on how the organization is going to address vicarious trauma. Training and professional development. This promotes continuing education, professional development, and networking opportunities. Staff are well-oriented to their jobs and participate in on and off-site learning opportunities. Vicarious trauma is an ongoing topic, not just one and done. Staff has been trained on vicarious trauma, signs and solutions, including stress inoculation, and how to build resilience. Staff at all levels are trained on mass violence incidents and the unique challenges to responders. They participate in drills and mock exercises. Training has to be competency-based, and job-specific training not only builds competence relative to a given role, it also boosts confidence and performance. And the last pillar, staff health and wellness. Vicarious trauma-informed organizations recognize the link between staff health and wellness and staff satisfaction and productivity. So they devote time and resources to promoting staff well-being and incorporate wellness into policies and practices. I know of one organization that gives staff an hour and a half for lunch if they're going to spend that time doing exercise. A quick summary then of the highlights of what makes an organization healthy. And you'll see how each one of these things shows up in what Mitch and Dave are going to cover next. The healthy organization fosters teamwork. People work in groups and committees because we know that collaboration is a protective factor in and of itself. So a vicarious trauma-informed organization is one that works together, not in silos. There are opportunities to collaborate and socialize, whether formal and informal, from attending trainings together to partner meetings with other agencies. It is focused on building relationships that create a positive culture, both within the organization and outside, because it's those very relationships that are put into action in a mass violence incident. You get to know each other before the bell goes off on a mass violence incident. This supportive organizational culture is not one that's all kumbaya. There is a clear protocol for how grievances in that organization are addressed. Negativity and inappropriate behavior, including bullying, are addressed immediately. In the next section, we're going to look back again at those stages of a mass violence response and talk about what kinds of strategies the organization has already been doing as preventative maintenance and the new ones that can be added as part of mass violence incident response. And the message is this: you can mitigate whether or not the response is negative, whether or not there can be a neutral response or a positive response. And it's by doing this preventative maintenance ahead of time. So let's start off, Mitch, with days 1 and 2.
So here we are with 1 to 2 days into this incident response. And you can see, of course, on the left column, all of the things that we're doing to address this incident and the way we are trying to support the victims. But we need to now talk about preventative maintenance strategies, things we should be doing that can, as Karen just mentioned, ways to mitigate the impacts on ourselves and on our staff. So acknowledging the risks of work, this is where leadership is so important. It's important that our leaders, and everyone can be a leader in this space, acknowledges that vicarious trauma is an occupational challenge. and that they proactively integrate strategies into workplace values. There's operational concerns and practices that all must be addressed as you're building this culture. In order to set up effective strategies, leadership must recognize that all staff, not just the frontline workers, but all staff, and this includes receptionists, dispatchers, CSI folks, people that would be considered on the periphery of the incident, all can be affected by the exposure to trauma and vicarious trauma. And we need to provide education around vicarious trauma and these incidents. So prior to the incident, responders should know their role in a mass violence incident and the work that they will be required to do. Training should be vicarious trauma informed and help responders understand how to do difficult tasks in a way that is trauma informed for survivors and vicarious trauma informed for themselves. The first time vicarious trauma is considered should not be the day of the incident. Helping responders understand the signs of vicarious trauma and the steps they can take to mitigate against us in their own lives helps responders better know how to care for themselves day to day, but also during a CMV response. Informed trauma supervision includes when staff are involved in acute or critical incident or working a difficult case, supervisors reach out and support staff. There is a standard protocol in place for debriefing and acknowledgement of the amount of exposure. So those policies need to be in place well before these things happen. Peer support teams have been formed and are well utilized in the agency. Staff feels comfortable seeing them without stigma and know that their confidentiality is maintained. If someone comes to you and says, boss, this is too much, I need a break, your preventative maintenance strategies are working because they self-adjusted, they've come to you, and that lets you know that your protocols and the culture you've created is working. It's also important for members of the peer support team who are not part of the response to be available to debrief those who are. In some cases, you'll have to bring an outside peer support team. I've done that personally. It works extremely well. And they surprisingly, if you're a vicarious trauma-informed culture, an outside peer support team will immediately enjoy credibility because your staff knows that this is what peer support's all about, and they will be open and honest about the feelings that they're grappling with. Setting up and increasing visibility of peer support teams not only allows them to be utilized in one of these responses, but also increases the likelihood of responders utilizing them. Managers should track staff exposure to traumatic incidents and assign roles and work assignments accordingly. Some agencies around the country are exploring the use of trauma exposure as a component of an early warning system. This is currently being done in Seattle. It'll be interesting to see what they finally implement and how it impacts their staff. While the organization works together to address vicarious trauma, it is helpful to have a person designated to address health and wellness issues, someone whose responsibility it is to make sure all of this is taking place. The buck stops there. And now I'll turn it over to Karen to talk about incident strategies.
When the organization is addressing vicarious trauma as preventative maintenance, like Mitch outlined, workers come into the CMV incident with a healthy work-life balance that supports them in this stressful situation. They can then draw on these strategies during the response itself. The work schedule in days 1 and 2 does not overburden responders and add to the intensity of the incident. Food and rest breaks are built in. Staff work rotating shifts. Debriefings are held for staff to demobilize as they end their shift. And briefings keep responders informed about what they need to know about the incident so they can do the job they were trained to do. Quiet spaces provide respite areas for responders to get away from the chaos and recuperate during their shifts. These can be arranged as part of the setup of the FRC and the FAC. Once a responder's shift is over, they are provided an opportunity to debrief prior to returning home to their families and regular routines. Debriefs allow responders to process what they have witnessed and mentally shift into a post-work mindset. Debriefs also allow opportunities to constructively discuss what went well, could have been done better, and strategize how improvements can be made. This allows the staff to have input, a tenet we discussed earlier, and that increases morale. Everyone is working together. A key mass violence strategy is that workers have been trained on how to perform their roles in a mass violence incident. They are prepared to do what must be done in a very difficult environment. And perhaps one of the most difficult tasks is doing death notifications. Training has been provided on how to do a death notification so that it is trauma-informed for survivors and vicarious trauma-informed for responders. Just a quick overview of some of the things that are addressed ahead of time in the death notification training is to make sure that you are supporting, you're doing what is necessary to support survivors. You're making sure that that death notification is being done by the proper people in the community, and it involves any necessary mental health professionals, and that it is done in a private, confidential area. I've heard people talk about sometimes they got the death notification on the bleachers at the auditorium where everybody was gathered after the incident. The death notification protocol also supports notifiers. It is done in pairs, so you have that support for each other, and that there is a debriefing between the members of the team before they leave and before they demobilize. One of the things I know from people who have done death notifications and received death notifications is they will always remember who gave them that news about the loved one. It is also something that notifiers remember as well. And Dave, as a former law enforcement officer, maybe you can share with us your experience of doing your first death notification.
Yeah, Karen, it really is imperative that we think intentionally about how these types of events, these notifications are handled. I know for me as an officer, one of the most emotionally traumatic incidents that I had to respond to during my career was making a death notification to the grandparents of their 18-year-old grandchild who they were raising following a traffic accident. Although as an officer, I had been involved in numerous critical incidents. I was a SWAT officer. I was a hostage negotiator. I worked in various undercover units. I was in multiple shootings, including one which involved a death. Yet none of these impacted me emotionally like having to do this death notification. This was a call that both I and my fellow officer, both veterans at the time, had never been trained for and had to figure out as things moved along. By the end of that call, we were all in tears. And due to our lack of insight or knowing how to do an effective response, neither us as officers or the citizens we were serving were offered and or made aware of support services. So this is something that we really want to strategically think about ahead of time so that we can be effectively prepared and we can truly serve our communities in the ways that we know that we can.
Dave, thank you so much for sharing that experience. It is certainly something about how the training does help support the survivors and also support the notifiers. I have a colleague who was the victim services person for a large police department, and she said that one of the things she liked to do best about her job was death notifications. And when she first said that, it sounded a little bit macabre to me, but what she explained was this. She knew that it was going to be the most difficult part of her job that day, but because she'd been trained and she knew what the protocol was, she felt confident that she knew how to do it right. And that's the kind of thing we want to send people in there to do. Mitch, can you now talk to us a little bit about preventative maintenance and what strategies we can use in days 3 through 9?
Thank you, Karen. So as you look at our screen, you can see in the far left column, we have the incident response, and those are all the aspects of this that we've been talking about. But as Dave was lining up for us, really, we want to think about preventative maintenance strategies. And one of the biggest and one of the most difficult to address in an agency is stigma. You know, stigma is very pernicious. It really is poisonous, and it is a barrier to people coming forward and getting the help they need. 55% of police officers are reluctant to come forward and tell their supervisor they're struggling because they feel it will negatively affect them in their career. That's a huge issue that we have to grapple with and we have to overcome. Stigma is a complex topic that involves personal experiences as well as workplace culture. Establishing an environment where stigma is not tolerated takes much work and reinforcement of values of openness and lack of judgment. And that is a key part of preventive maintenance that agencies are now addressing. Continual education and awareness of the aspects of vicarious trauma will go a long way to guide the organization to stigma reduction. A vicarious trauma-informed agency will have put in place a number of resources and policies to address both the day-to-day impact of work and an incident such as this. As part of preventive maintenance, EAP policies were reviewed and culturally competent. Trauma-informed counselors are available to respond to staff and their families. Command staff will receive updates as the incident unfolds regarding staff well-being and how strategies in place for the mass violence incident are working and where. And it's important to note that the counselors through EAP also should have had prior experience with law enforcement, fire rescue, dispatchers, et cetera, so that this cultural competence is reached. Staff health and wellness program encourages exercise, nutrition, sleep, meditation, and reflection. Ideally, the agency now has put into place a wellness program, which encourages better exercise, nutrition, and stress reduction practices. There has been much increase in our knowledge with regard to rest, nutrition, and its impact on neurological functioning so that employees can be more resilient when assigned to incidents that are both demanding physically, mentally, and emotionally. Command staff support for these programs are essential, vital, if they are expected to be effective. Now, Karen will talk to us about incident strategies.
So the plan is implemented, and as we move into days 3 through 9, these are the things that are taking place. There's continued scheduling and demobilization protocols. Clear communication is practiced with briefings, and the organization is in the actual implementation of what it had drilled on. Attention is paid to what the work environment is like at the FAC. There is no need for additional stressors. Negativity and inappropriate behavior is quickly addressed. If someone is acting inappropriately for whatever reason, they are compassionately but quickly dealt with. The quiet room becomes a respite in itself. Mental health support is available for everyone at the FAC. Responders, victim services, emergency management, the media, elected officials. Everyone is united in that this is stressful for everyone, and everyone is working together for the good of survivors. They are all dealing with huge issues themselves and the community as a team.
You know, in a healthy organization, a vicarious trauma-informed organization, the preventive maintenance strategies are firmly in place and support the organization and its staff through the long haul of a criminal mass violence response. Workers enter day 9 through 30 healthier when they are rested in their normal day-to-day activities, including using vacation time and differentiating between work and non-work hours. You do get some time off. You do get to be off sometimes. Additionally, collaboration with other organizations should be valued. When collaboration with other agencies is regularly promoted, staff enters the criminal mass violence incident with strong working relationships with people they stand side by side with at the criminal mass violence event. Opportunities for collaboration should be promoted across the organization and not just given to a select few leadership members. Collaboration opportunities could include participation in the development of a criminal mass violence protocol, training attendance, conference attendance, and participation in mock exercises and drills, to name a few. This allows responders, not just leadership, to know each other and their roles. Staff are also better prepared to cover for coworkers who are absent or move into new positions. At the criminal mass violence event itself, vicarious trauma-informed supervisors oversee the response, adjusting schedules and workloads as needed. Leave time is granted without stigma, and this time is for wellness, not sick leave. Supervisors monitor how staff is doing and what else is needed for those involved in the criminal mass violence response. The organization has instituted practices that serve to motivate and aid interveners in their ongoing efforts to perform their duties. Gradually, as workers return to their daily routine, their schedules and tasks, everyone is recognized for their efforts, whether at the scene or supporting those who are by continuing to fulfill the mission of the organization. All the preventive maintenance strategies previously discussed can assist with the lasting impact of being involved in a criminal mass violence response. Mental health wellness checks for all responders, regardless of agency rank, can also be helpful. Additionally, the effectiveness of preventive maintenance strategies should be evaluated on a regular basis. This allows for course corrections to be identified and made if needed, which helps organizations get back on track to best support staff during and outside of criminal mass violence responses. Mass violence incident strategies specifically designed to address the long-term impacts of criminal mass violence include conducting post-critical incident seminars and having EMDR therapists available. Make certain that protocols are set up to reach back to those who have stopped reaching out or never reached out in the first place. Some may have initially reached out for help and stopped, deciding to bear the weight alone. Fear of being broken if they reach out for needing help. It is important to recognize that a trial may be a trigger for responders and have resources in place for both responders who are testifying and responders watching the proceedings unfold for those testifying. Counselors familiar with the criminal justice system should be available to all responders. There can often be a dynamic of 1 to 2 responders testifying and getting pressure to say the right thing or to get the right outcome. So special attention should be paid to those testifying. Responders who choose to attend memorials should be allowed and encouraged to do so. Responders may also need assistance in effectively dealing with the deep connections they have formed with victims and survivors. Finally, do not forget the families of responders. Be careful to address how the home lives of responders might be impacted in both the short and long run. Have resources for responders' family members. Check in individually as well as collectively to see if appropriate coping mechanisms are being practiced. Educate on the impact of inappropriate coping strategies, such as substance abuse, tighter control at home, etc., and how they can spiral out of control.
So as we move into the individual strategies, I will say that a lot have already been talked about. So I'm not going to go through each thing on this slide. I do want to highlight a couple of things to make sure that people are thinking about their own personal preparedness walking into incidents like this. Stress inoculation is really giving yourself a chance to think about what would be stressful for you in these situations and what you might do. And so giving yourself time to go through a process. I often do it on a plane if I am headed somewhere. Just go through the process. What might I encounter? How might I react? What are the good coping skills that I have? And really thinking about what do you know about yourself, and when you're stressed, what comes out, so that you can identify your level of stress. We're all really good at avoiding that. So it's a really good thing to start to really pay attention to that. The other thing to think about is doing things that are in the moment, very short, but can be really helpful. 2 or 3 minutes of breathing, a specific song that you put on your phone that you can listen to while you're in the back of an Uber going from one place to the other. A quick walk around the building, maybe, just to change the air that you're breathing. And then one of my favorite things is to have what I call a hang up friend, who is prepped before I go, that if my name appears in the middle of the day on their phone, that they should not expect pleasantries. They should not expect me to care what's happening in their life in that moment. What I need is to vent for a few minutes. And then as soon as I am finished with that, it is likely that I will hang up on them. It is a great outlet to have. Next slide, please. Thinking about from an individual / organizational perspective, thinking about how do you go and transition from one place to the other, from work to home, from home back into work, into the mass violence response, and what that might look like, and actually being very conscious and deliberate about the fact that you need to be a different person in each of those places. And how are you going to do that? I think the other thing that really goes hand in hand with that is thinking about how you're thinking about what is happening. Are you thinking, if you have a 13-year-old and you just responded to a school where a 13-year-old was shot at, what does that do in your brain, and how are you thinking about that? Because that is going to impact how you react yourself and to other people in your environment. So the other things on the right side of your screen right now are more connected to doing the norm, what we know is out there. Although the ones at the bottom, the yoga, the meditation, sometimes when you can get yourself out of the immediate response, what you need is just to be able to take a deep breath and calm yourself down. And so thinking about those alternative interventions might be really helpful. I'm going to hand it back to Mitch, who's going to talk about sort of where do we start and how do we get moving.
Thank you, Tara. So here we're looking at some low-hanging fruit and ways that we can jump right in to begin changing a culture. And that's not an easy thing to do. As you know, it can be years in the making to turn your agency into one that is trauma informed. But it starts with a lot of small steps. And one of them, of course, is training. So whether it's training at lineups or roll calls or online training modules, or doing mock drills where you literally go through all the steps it takes to activate the people involved and then vet out how well you're doing, how well you will perform in a situation like this. But it's training, getting people used to thinking about vicarious trauma, because let's face it, vicarious trauma, as you've heard, doesn't happen just with mass violence. It is an everyday occurrence in our professions and something that must be addressed frontally. Second thing is a resource inventory. My guess is you probably have a lot more resources within your jurisdiction than you may be aware of. If we're talking about being victim-centered and there's a local hospital, how many of those local hospital employees might be just perfect in a response like this, but have never been activated before? Or we're talking about a lot of smaller organizations that may have folks that are licensed clinical social workers, may be therapists. All of them can be the building blocks of a very effective response strategy, but you got to know who they are. You literally have to find out who they are, their willingness to help, and then begin building those relationships and establishing protocols, and then testing those protocols. Will they work when it comes time to use them? And then finally, research. There's so much research. Obviously, we're going to tell you to start with our website and all of the great data and protocols that are there just for you, but also research other agencies that may be already emulating the type of culture you want to become. Who are they? How can they help? They can be that person that you can call as you're working through some of this process that can help you say, hey, don't do it this way, do it that way. Oh, be aware that when you try to do this, look for the following things to happen. But it's really all about training, working with others, and being as well informed as you can as you begin to change this culture.
So we have given you a tremendous amount of information about vicarious trauma. We have talked about responders and the need to think about this very specifically in relation to them. We also want to give you the bigger context of where this fits into the program that is bringing you this webinar today. So the ICP TTA program, our job is really to help communities create a criminal mass violence and domestic terrorism annex to their all hazards plan. And we have a method for how we do that, how we facilitate communication, facilitate getting answers to very specific questions, all of those kinds of things. Once that annex is developed, our secondary goal is to make sure that it gets included in the exercise calendar for the jurisdiction. So we're really looking at very concrete deliverables for the overall program. If we look at sort of the basis, the foundation of the program, there are 16 best practices that in planning that we use as our guiding organization. And you will notice that number 12 on this chart in front of you is first responder support. And this is very clearly where the vicarious trauma experienced by by responders fits. But you'll see that there's a lot of other information that we've actually touched on. Mitch just talked about the committee and understanding who needs to be involved and what those relationships look like. We talked about communications. We talked about all sorts of different kinds of things. So the program really looks at any of these, at all of these, depending on your jurisdiction's needs and wants. But definitely first responder support is in there. Next slide, please. We also have on-demand resources. So you can apply for the program. There'll be a link at the bottom or on the last slide for that application. And we can come in with consultants, work with your community, do all of that facilitation and get a plan for you. We also have on-demand resources on our website. The website is icptta.com. And we have a set of trainings. This one you access through there. There are many others there that you should feel free to look at. With that, every time you watch one of the trainings, you can contact the program and have a question and answer with the subject matter experts who conducted the training, the webinar, so that you can start to get some specific information for your community. We have 2 resources that are specifically developed to help communities. One is an annex template, that our consultants use, but will also be available for communities to use themselves. And then also an exercise guide and scenario template. And what that does is it actually takes existing exercises, drills, tabletops, whatever you have planned in your community, and will help you extend them into the victim care pieces. And both of these documents were written by people with a tremendous amount of experience. So those are available on our website, and you don't have to apply to the program for those. They're just available on the website. So on the additional resources that we're really looking at, OVC TTAC, Office for Victims of Crime Training and Technical Assistance, does have the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit. And there is a tremendous amount of information in there. There is an assessment that you can take to that you as an organization can take that will tell you how vicarious trauma informed you are. What are you doing now, and what does that look like in terms of the scope of being vicariously trauma informed? There's also a blueprint once you know where you stand to help you increase your capacity to be vicarious trauma informed. And there is very specific through OVC TTAC training and technical assistance for agencies. So you can contact them directly. You can contact them through us as well. And they will actually come in and help train staff. They'll help you go through the assessment process. They'll look at the blueprint with you. There's a lot of training and technical assistance that they can assist you with. So it's a tremendous resource. And then finally, our contact information is on the screen. And what you see is our email and phone number, but also that QR code, if you hold your phone up to it, will take you directly to our application. The application is also available at the link underneath that and on our website. Our website is icptta.com. And on that website, you can find the application in the top right-hand corner, as well as access to all of the resources that we've already talked about. So with that, we want to thank you for your attention. We hope that this information is really helpful to you. Please feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about anything you heard today, or you want your community to become more vicariously trauma informed in response to the responders to these really difficult events. And with that, we again thank you for your time and hope that we hear from you.